welcome to Scope. I'm Waqar Rizvi. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. We're going to start off by discussing the Israeli elections, and certainly we can discuss what it means for Benny Gantz to likely have the upper hand in that regard, just by one seat, possibly again, as the results continue to flow in, over Benjamin Netanyahu, who was hoping for a fifth term in office. Both, though, when it comes to the occupation of Palestinian territories, essentially seem to be the same policies, on both sides. You remember then when Netanyahu said that he would annex the Jordan Valley and the West Bank, that Gantz essentially said that he stole that idea off of his party. So not much difference when it comes to that specific policy. But then one of the interesting results out of this election, again, that would need to be confirmed in the coming days once those official results are completed, is that the Arab Joint List seems to have made some significant progress and may very well now be part of the quote-unquote opposition in the Knesset. What does that then mean? Because as Ayman Odeh of the Arab Joint List said to Netanyahu that your incitement has had this price. And then he expressed pride that we, quote-unquote, the Arab citizens with our votes prevented the formation of an extremist right-wing government led by Netanyahu. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Jack Kennedy, who's a Middle East analyst. He's senior analyst for Middle East and North Africa for IHS Market Economics and Country Risk. He's joining us now by Skype from London. We're also joined by Dr. Nick Panagiotides. He is the head of the Geostrategic Observatory of the Middle East and assistant professor of international politics at American College. He's joining us now from Nicosia in Cyprus. And we're also joined by Ayman Mhanna, who is executive director of the Samir Kassir Foundation, one of the leading freedom of expression and media development organizations in the Middle East. He's joining us now from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Ayman, Nick, and Jack, thank you to all three of you for your time. Jack, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the results of these elections? Does this even really matter for the Arabs/Palestinians?
I think it is a significant election in and of itself. As you say, at this point, it's very difficult to outline exactly who won, given that the electoral results were so close. But we can, I think, in some ways say who didn't win, and that certainly appears to be Netanyahu. His big strategic gamble with these elections was that he could improve his position in comparison to the elections that were held in April, and that has failed. That's a significant blow to his domestic credibility, and it's going to significantly weaken his position going into a pre-indictment hearing for corruption cases that are due in the beginning of October.
And then, Jack, do you think it is concerning that Palestinians weren't really even part of the discussion when it came to these elections, that this entire political campaign?
I don't think that's unusual for the Israeli electoral system and the signs before the election was held, certainly around the competition between the hard right parties in Israel and the necessary positions that the blue and white party under Benny Gantz would have to take going into it, meant that the inclusion of Palestinian interests in that sense was never going to be a particular priority, I think.
Ayman, I wonder what your thoughts are about that, because as you well know, Ayman, before the elections took place, Netanyahu came up with this threat, essentially, and this promise that if he were to win, that he would annex parts of the West Bank as well as the Jordan Valley. But then Gantz essentially saying that, Netanyahu stole that off of him. So not much difference, really, when it comes to Palestinian occupation, is there?
I don't think there would be much difference for Palestinians in general, because what these elections have shown is that the Israelis just wanted a quote-unquote nicer version of the right. The results of the left-wing parties, Israeli left-wing parties, is catastrophic. Not even 11 seats between Labour and Ehud Barak-led party. So it showed that it confirmed the fundamental shift of the Israeli electorate to the right. And the concept of the peace process, the concept of negotiations, were completely absent from all negotiations. So this is the most important element for Arabs in general, for the neighbors of Israel, is that it confirmed the positioning of the Israeli public to the right. Now, what really happened was a fatigue towards the longevity of Netanyahu's in power, the corruption allegations, the very radical position he also took in terms of the US-Israeli positioning, where he basically cut ties with anyone who's not pro-Trump in the US. So this is what the elections were about, much more than anything related to the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli negotiations or peace process.
So then, Nick, do you think that the Arab joint list being some seemingly gain in this election, is that significant, or do you think we're making too much of it?
It's significant. It has a meaning, but first of all, let me underline something else. Now in Israel, we are in front of a political stalemate. As Blue and White Party has ruled out sitting with a Netanyahu government in a coalition. The Lieberman, on the other hand, the so-called regulator, said that he will not sit in a government that Blue and White and Likud participate. So we are in front of a stalemate about what is going to be done, how the next Israeli government will be formed. As far as the Arabs are concerned, the Palestinians, I think the electoral result gives them the right to want some other things. It sends a meaning to the political system that they must not be neglected, that they are citizens of equal rights in Israel, and they have to fulfill their needs there.
Indeed. And Jack, on that point then, the Arabs who were able to vote in these elections, as we well know, and there have been charts put online about many who weren't able to vote and aren't allowed to vote. But nevertheless, the Arab Joint List, as I put to you earlier as well, has done fairly okay. Do you think that there is actually a possibility of it actually ever being part of any government going forward, considering Netanyahu, on the night of when these elections ended, essentially said that, there needed to be a Zionist government in place, one that did not include, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, his words, basically terrorists. Again, an accusation which the Arab Joint List has faced many times over the years. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's less likely that the Joint List will seek to be part of a functioning coalition government at this point. I mean, the statements that we've seen so far suggest that if they do emerge as the third largest party, that their preference would be to establish themselves as the official opposition in Israel and in Israeli politics. I think they could achieve, or they would consider a lot of their domestic political goals to be achievable under that kind of setup. They'd be able to actively resist any of the more hard right political policies of any future government. They would have access to confidential security briefings, and under that envelope, I think it would be a lot easier for them to maintain a significance that might not necessarily be the place, given the kind of concessions that would have to be made to be part of a potential coalition government.
That's a good point, isn't it, Ayman? Because, now when we talk about the Arab Joint List and the gains that it has had, one of the reasons that Ayman Odeh, at least the Joint List chairman, has made for why those gains may have occurred is because he and his party members went out and convinced the Arab citizens of Israel that, listen, you need to vote because it's actually Netanyahu who doesn't want you to vote, basically, especially then again citing his many statements against Arabs and Palestinians of the past. Is this significant? Will this create a shift of some sort about the conversation towards Arabs?
The shift on the long term will be made based on what policies will be implemented and how the Arab Joint List will be active in parliament. Specifically, if the Arab Joint List becomes the official opposition in case of a potentially likely coalition between Likud and Blue and White, it is major because the official opposition in the Israeli constitution and the leader of the official opposition is entitled to security from Shin Bet, is entitled to security briefings. This would be cataclysmic and a fundamental change in the political system, and it's a test to all those who say that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Will they respect parties that are following the constitution, present in the Knesset, and provide them, regardless of their ethnic or religious affiliation, with the duties and rights of the opposition? And the second major element for the Arab joint list is, unfortunately, the total absence of relevance of the Palestinian parties in West Bank and Gaza that are still divided, that are still focusing more on their internal infightings, on violations of basic rights of Palestinians inside the Gaza and the West Bank. So if there is a dynamism coming from the Arab and Palestinians, it is at the level of the joint list, and unfortunately not with the PA, not with the Palestinian Authority, and definitely not with Hamas.
That's an interesting point. Nick, I wonder where your thoughts are on that, because even having the Arabs in the official opposition is still, some significant progress, is it not?
Waqar, I agree with the other guests that what will happen is that the Arabs will gain bargaining power regarding some internal matters. But as far it is concerned, the essential thing about the two-state solution, about the occupation, will be like the same. Nothing will change. On the other hand, I have to say that traditionally, the Arab parties do not participate in government coalitions in Israel. And as far as I know, they will not participate in a future Israeli government. They will remain as opposition. Just as information, because I saw in some news that they may participate in a government, but this is not the precedent as far as the particular case is concerned.
Okay. All right, so Jack, I'm going to give you the final word just very quickly, in under a minute, please. How does all of this, if at all, affect this two-state solution, the deal of the century as put forth by Trump, in your opinion?
Well, regarding the deal of the century, I think that at this point, that's likely to be on hold or on ice for a significant period at this point. The Trump administration's relationship with that plan has been so directly tied to Netanyahu as leader, and we've already been seeing over the last few days Trump in his statements to the media putting some distance between himself and Netanyahu. So there's going to be a step back from trying to push that for sure. Regarding the two-state solution, I think it's going to continue very much in the status quo that it is at the moment, which is to say there's going to be very little development moving forward from either side, whatever the formation of the final government after this election is going to be.
All right, we'll leave there as a final word, but of course we appreciate Nick and Ayman for their insight and of course for their time today. Viewers, this is an interesting election, again, because of the Arab joint list, in my opinion, and the gains that it has made, even though it may not at the end, once the tally is completely counted and brought up, especially for the double envelopes, including military members, prisoners, etc., that still apparently needs to be counted as of this recording. But if the Arab joint list miraculously still comes out with enough seats, 11, I believe, or 12 it needs in the Knesset, to be part of the official opposition, this would be a seismic shift and would have important impacts within Israel, as Ayman there mentioned as well, vis-a-vis needing national security briefings and otherwise. What does that then mean for Israel? Would that threaten the Jewishness of Israel, as Netanyahu and Gantz and others were talk about? Netanyahu, remember, saying that we must have, quote unquote, a Zionist government, not a government which has people in it that support terrorists. Again, talking about the Arab joint list. This is a test for what is called the only democracy of the Middle East, and we'll keep a very close eye on that going forward here at Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who is now being granted permission on Tuesday to appeal a ruling by judges that had earlier blocked her investigation into alleged war crimes that have taken place in Afghanistan. Those war crimes, the prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, says were carried out by the likes of the Taliban, the Afghan government, and U.S. forces between the years 2003 and 2004 specifically. But of course, we can talk about war crimes in Afghanistan in a much more general fashion ever since the U.S. got involved there. Another interesting report that has come out by the UN recently is that the Afghan government and its international backers have in fact killed more civilians in the first 3 months of this year, 2019, than the Taliban and other insurgent groups. And you wouldn't know that considering the news coverage and how it seems to be skewed. This is obviously the first time since the UN began tracking civilian casualties in Afghanistan over a decade ago that the pro-government forces have in fact caused the most deaths now. And then finally, just before coming on air here, I read about Australian special forces who have now also been accused of committing war crimes in Afghanistan. That's in an internal secret defense report that's been leaked to Australian media. So it seems there's war crimes going around and everyone's really hands are dirty when it comes to Afghanistan. What does that mean? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined by Mirwais, who is a journalist and writer who covers mainly Afghanistan affairs. He's joining us now from Islamabad. We're also joined by Maryam Sarhan, who is a researcher of international studies and diplomacy at the University of London, SOAS. She's joining us now from London. Maryam and Mirwais, thank you both for your time today. Maryam, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the seemingly small victory that Fatou Bensouda of the ICC has been able to gain? I imagine there are a lot of obstacles in her path, but do you think it's worth looking into all these war crimes that possibly have been committed by all these parties?
Thank you so much for having me. I certainly think it is a small step towards victory that the appeal has been granted. But unfortunately, I think that there will be a lot of issues in terms of cooperation in order to, to get the evidence that is needed to really ensure that this case moves forward. With some of the comments that the Trump administration has made thus far, it's evident that that will prove to be difficult. But I do commend the prosecutor for being so persistent in moving forward with this. And I do hope that there is progress that's made, but unfortunately, I think it is highly unlikely.
Okay, so Mirwais, what are your thoughts on that? War crimes that have possibly been carried out in Afghanistan. How important is that to be highlighted to, again, then contextualize the situation right now, as the U.S. has tried to at least reach a peace deal with the Taliban?
Thank you, Waqar, for your time, for your chance to talk. Waqar, the first thing, in 2001, when America came to Afghanistan for Osama bin Laden, everything started. There was no war at that moment. There was no Taliban. First time the Taliban started, just because of the reason that the ISAF, which is called the UN forces, started killing innocent people. And that's the time when Taliban started rising again. And it increased day by day because of the reason. There are many war crimes going from Afghan government people.
Maryam, go back to you if I can. When we're talking about war crimes, Maryam, again, as I'd put to Mirwais, it's important to contextualize how we are where we are now, aren't we, 18 years into this situation there in Afghanistan and the U.S. involvement there, and why it is that the Taliban may still be as strong as they are, possibly even stronger all these years later, and why it is that the U.S. has now been pushed to enter into dialogue with them. Do you think that on many people's part, they haven't realized that the human rights violations, the abuses carried out by the U.S. forces as well as coalition forces have possibly led to a lot of resentment and otherwise?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that the proceedings in the ICC hopefully will shed light on the critical issues that are still facing the country. Even though they have not a good record in terms of the convictions that they've made, with 17 cases and only 3 of which had convictions. But I hope that the ICC continues to make the right steps forward.
Okay, so then if we're talking about the right steps forward, then Maryam, what do you think that would mean? Obviously, Fatou Bensouda, as you know, her visa had been rejected by the U.S. Pompeo had clearly said that he would not allow for any ICC investigation, at least within the U.S. borders, to take place. That pretty much just puts a stop on all this, doesn't it? And does that then mean accountability is pretty much impossible at this time?
I think that that's certainly that intimidation, that politics that comes into play, unfortunately, does make conflict with the legal processes that need to happen to ensure that justice is delivered. And so I think a lot of times people forget to separate the law from the politics. And so the ICC's main focus should be strictly with looking at the law and analyzing that alone. And I think, unfortunately, the Trump administration has gotten away with its bullying once again. And I think it's important that the ICC, regardless of that, continues to, put politics aside and consider how the reluctance that they've shown thus far is allowing the U.S. to think that they will not need to cooperate and really just kind of closing the chapter even before we've begun.
Indeed. Okay, Mirwais is back with us. Mirwais, you can hear me clearly. Just tell us about, we got cut off before you were able to complete your thoughts, and also just tell us about what your thoughts are on the fact that the U.S. is trying to block any investigation into its actions and its servicemen's actions in Afghanistan.
Yeah, they are doing it from the beginning. They are doing it from the beginning because they have did the miserable things in Afghanistan, and the miserable things they have did over there. They can't bring those things in front of the world because the real face will be shown to the world. So they will do whatever they have to do to stop this real investigations. And that's the reason I don't think so they will agree to those terms. Because if the real investigation does and the real face of the America can front, nobody will like the face of America anymore.
Okay, and then Mirwais, I wonder what you think accountability would look like and how important it is for these crimes, for peace to actually come in to Afghanistan, because I imagine for any peace deal to be successful and for the country to be peaceful going forward, there needs to be some justice, doesn't there?
Waqar, can I explain 2 points over here? Because
Sure.
I got the chance to see something regarding that.
Sure.
Waqar, the first thing is that many people think that media over there is free and they can declare whatever they want. There are many stories which are hideouts. And because I was there for 9 years. So I'm telling you that there are many war stories which are still hideouts from the world, which has not come at front. So, and we were stopped to cover those stories. So if the UN is starting an investigation, which is a very good thing, and which will help out to the base of the Taliban, because the Taliban started again just because of the one reason. The base was that war crime from the UN forces and Afghan forces both. So if they started, this is a very basic thing, and it is a very good thing for all of the people of Afghanistan, because if you get justice, you stop fighting. So if many people who joined Taliban are just because of the reason they are not getting the justice. So if you give the justice to them, the cause of their fight will be no more.
Yeah.
And there will be a peace in Afghanistan. So it's a very good thing which they started, but I don't think so that America will allow them and will move them toward that stage.
Indeed, and that's a good point, isn't it, Maryam? Because I wonder what your thoughts are on if the likes of where you're sitting, for example, in the UK or the US and others who are involved in Afghanistan still, do you think that the people, the citizens of those countries realize that essentially by creating this resentment in the hearts, be it of Afghans or others, because of these many war crimes, alleged war crimes, I'll say, that have occurred there, that in fact, that's actually endangering them in some way too, isn't it? Because it keeps support for the Taliban going.
Certainly. And I think that there just comes a point where, it's important to recognize that, of course, not many countries, if any at all, would be happy to have such an investigation or would be so forthcoming with such an investigation. And I'm not certain that, the ICC's decision either way will solve all of these issues, but I definitely think it would symbolize an element of accountability, justice, some of the values that I think people all over the world share and value together. So, it's certainly not the solution per se, but it would definitely be a light of hope, I would say.
And then that brings into question then, doesn't it, Maryam, about how moral all these armies have been. Even though around the world, we will talk about, for example, the Israelis would say that they're the most moral army in the world, but that's possibly a separate argument. But even the Western armies involved in Afghanistan would say, listen, we've done our best to avoid civilian casualties. Now, that's a statement, as you know, which is standard every time civilians are killed in the aftermath. Is that essentially just rhetoric?
I mean, again, I don't think many countries are, willing to accept their flaws, their mistakes. Certainly it's not always things that the top leaders can control. Sometimes things go wrong, but that doesn't mean that accountability shouldn't be there. And, again, I hope it's, as ICC as being something as a part of the UN, and looking at the SDGs, for example, some of the sustainable development goals and how tied they are to just creating a better place and a better world for everyone. I think it's important that, as global citizens, we all partake in that, regardless of what country we come from, what faith we have, what our nationalities are. I think that it is important that we continue to make improvements on that, and for every nation to keep to its commitments in regards to that.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but of course, we both Maryam and Mirwais for their time today, and of course, for their insight. Viewers, an important topic because, again, it seems like for many people around the world, what's happening in Afghanistan is on the back burner, essentially. It's not a priority anymore. And what many may not realize is the precedent of not allowing for justice to occur. As for anywhere in the world, really, would only mean more resentment going forward and more ill-feeling going forward. And in fact, that just means more support for groups like the Taliban or other groups around the world who may be acting out in violent ways now or in the future, possibly even. Without justice for these sorts of war crimes and crimes in general towards the Afghan people and others, these sorts of things cannot be settled. And the ICC must be allowed to really take this case forward without any obstacles, even in the United States, if the U.S. really claims that it does everything in its power, to avoid civilian casualties. It shouldn't be afraid of it then if an investigation is done to prove that, an independent investigation by an independent body. Again, if the U.S. is being truthful in that regard. We'll keep a very close eye on how that develops and if this ICC case is actually allowed to move forward here in scope. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In today's final segment of the show, we're going to discuss Edward Snowden. He's released a book called Permanent Record. And you will know that Edward Snowden, of course, was that NSA whistleblower, and he had published a number of course, important information through WikiLeaks and others about the activities of the NSA and the CIA. And, of course, the U.S. government has targeted him ever since. He's now based somewhere in Russia, they say Moscow. But anyways, when it comes to this book specifically, the Justice Department has gone after this book, filing a lawsuit against his publication, against Snowden as well, mind you, and the publisher, and not wanting this book its distribution, to be stopped. But in fact, they want all the proceeds from that book to not go to Snowden. And in fact, they also want the proceeds from all of the speeches and otherwise that Snowden has been giving about this topic to also not be given to Snowden. It's rather comical, of course, as one expert had put it, that Snowden has had this lawsuit filed against him, considering he's actually famous for leaking classified information. And the U.S. is saying that, listen, he did not follow our non-disclosure agreements. His lawyer says if he had given this text to the Justice Department, the CIA, what's to say they would have approved it or approved it at all, really? And none of the information in this book is actually information which is classified in any way, that this is being spoken about publicly for years now, ever since Snowden's revelations. Let's discuss this all a bit further with our esteemed panelists. We're joined by Timo Kivimäki, who is a professor of international relations. In addition to his academic work, he's a frequent consultant to several governments around the world, as well as to several UN and EU organizations, specifically on the topics of conflict and terrorism. He's joining us now from Bristol. We're also joined by Isidor de Coma, who is a geopolitical analyst, and he's currently joining us from London. Timo and Isidor, thank you both for your time this morning. Timo, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this lawsuit, especially the way it's being worded? It's kind of awkward, isn't it, where the U.S. doesn't actually want its distribution to be stopped, but it just doesn't want the proceeds to go to Snowden.
This sounds awkward, but the reason why this is the case is that there is a precedence. There has been a similar case where a former CIA agent revealed information about the Vietnam War, and as a result, the court decided that the proceeds of his publications will go to the state rather than to himself. So it is something that they can now refer to.
Okay, so then do you think this intimidation tactic, I mean, is it in line with what many would argue, listen, is Snowden's right to free speech and to release such a memoir, especially considering none of the information in it is really actually classified. It's pretty much now public knowledge.
I think the question is not really free speech question, because of course there are issues that you cannot reveal and issues that you shouldn't reveal. I think the problem is that you shouldn't be allowed to make secret information that is concealing illegalities. If that's the case, then the state can do, or certain state departments can do illegalities without any risk of being caught for that. So I think the problem here is really not so much of free speech. The problem is whether the state is allowed or should be allowed to make secret information that is about their illegal activities.
That's a very good point. Isidor, I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because this does seem like an intimidation tactic, doesn't it? Another way for the U.S. to target Snowden and to punish him for daring to, as Timo there correctly mentioned, to essentially out illegal actions that were done by the U.S. government.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of sounds like if the U.S. government wanted to impose some sanctions on Edward Snowden. I agree. It is a weird situation. It's kind of, they only want the economic benefit, but at the same time, the lawsuit is only asking for the economic benefit from the books published by the U.S. companies, the publishers, not by other publishers in other areas. I know, for instance, the publisher in Spain who has the rights to sell this book in the Spanish translation, and they have not been requested by any judge. So it's kind of only a punishment. Like in U.S. soil, you're not gonna get revenue from this information. But I agree with Timo. It has a precedent with the Vietnam papers, the so-called Pentagon papers that were released in 1971. And in that case, one judge said that the U.S. people has the right, he called the right of the people to know. And in this case, considering that this is, the reason why Edward Snowden leaked this information, it was not because he wanted to benefit an enemy or because he wanted to obtain economic revenue from it. According to him, it was he had the duty to publish it because, according to him, it was illegal practices. So it is weird how the DOJ is acting, but it kind of makes sense.
Okay, so then Timo, many people, as you, Timo, would entitle somebody like Snowden or even Assange, Julian Assange, as heroes for the important work that they do for publishing this sort of information, leaking this sort of information for not just the U.S., but of course mainly the U.S. Do you think that they are heroes, or do you think that there is some balance needed in how we can talk about them? Because the other side would say, listen, they've actually put U.S. national security and U.S. interests in risk.
I think I have a bit kind of a balanced view in that sense that I think on the one hand it is not okay to reveal classified documents and some of the documents that I've seen being classified have been kind of diplomatically problematic, even if not kind of security risk or anything. I think the problem here is that really we don't seem to have regulations on what we can make secret and what we cannot make secret. When the government, in Snowden's case, when the government conceals something, illegal activities, that's a problem for the law and order. When the government gives an impression of their, let's say, interventions, which is completely incorrect, it is then, I think, the duty of those involved to reveal what the government does, because this is a question of democracy. If the voters don't know what the government does, obviously the voters cannot make wise decisions. Now, whether so in this sense, I think we would need to address questions that we haven't addressed, and most important of them is the question of what can we and what cannot we make secret.
Indeed. And, Isidor, I imagine that all of us could refer to U.S. foreign policy as being the one that was most affected by these leaks in general, through WikiLeaks and Snowden and otherwise, considering it showed, U.S. actions abroad in the war zones that it was involved in. And it's not targeting necessarily of civilians, but the fact that it did kill civilians as it was targeting others as well. And again, carelessly. Do you think that has had a positive impact, or have we essentially now gone into a time where the governments are now even more obsessed with keeping this information secret?
Okay, that's a good question. First of all, I would like to highlight that there is a difference between, for instance, Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden. While some leak classified information, the whole work of Edward Snowden has been to leak the system through which this information is obtained. And I believe there is a big difference in the sense that Edward Snowden is not releasing just confidential data, is advocating against the way in which this data is being collected, saying that it is illegal. That created a diplomatic crisis between Germany and the US, for instance, with a call from Chancellor Angela Merkel to Obama to show her anger. It canceled a state visit from, at that time, Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff to the US for the same reasons. So, and even made the Congress pass new legislation regarding how information was to be collected. This is a big point, and for sure, since then, the U.S. government is more cautious about what information is provided to the workers and how they can restrict it from being published, especially because, the precedents with Edward Snowden as the best example, they have been successful. They have been able to publish it, and the people have supported them mostly instead than to the government.
Indeed. So then, Timo, this brings me to a question, a macro then on this issue. If governments around the world, especially in the Western world, want such information to not be made public, and for there not to be accountability in that specific regard about their actions, possibly overseas, as I'd mentioned to Isidor as well, about the killing of civilians, the carelessness that went into those airstrikes. You and I have watched those videos, of course, which went viral at that time. Does that not then affect the quality of democracy then in many of these countries?
Absolutely. Obviously, we need to know the truth about these interventions. What I'm astonished, though, is that it's not just secret information that we need to know about operations abroad. Even the completely open source information, we don't hear about that from the media. Let me give you an example. On average, if we look at statistics of war fatalities, on average, a protective military intervention by the US increases the number of fatalities by 80%, and countries are on average left with more than three times more fatalities after the operation is over. Whereas in UN operations, if such operations are left for the UN, there is a clear decline in conflict fatalities. We clearly don't get that picture when we listen to the media. We get a picture of fantastic success and important security operations. We don't hear the fact that they normally fail.
Indeed, and that's why these conversations are so very important. And of course, we do appreciate Timo and Isidor for their time today. We'll leave it there at that. We, of course, have benefited a lot from their insight. Viewers, again, this lawsuit is rather comical, as I said in my introduction, considering Snowden did leak classified information, but the U.S. is going after him for not following a non-disclosure agreement, which he apparently has with the U.S., considering he was an NSA contractor. That doesn't really make sense, but the U.S. doesn't even want his book to not be distributed. It just wants the money from it, doesn't want the money to go into Snowden's hands, and in fact, also wants the money from Snowden's speeches and any other speaking engagements or other engagements that he may have had ever since leaking this information to WikiLeaks and others around the world. Again, a circular and weird argument being played by the Justice Department of the United States. But most importantly, it's also then about the fact that these are supposed to be free societies. These are supposed to be societies where you are allowed to hold your governments to account. What of that reputation then? Has that reputation essentially been just a facade from day one? And these governments don't really agree with being held to account in any regard, be it for war crimes abroad or otherwise. But we'll keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. But I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.